Welcome everyone to Akash's PhD defense. I'm Rosemary Knight, Akash's advisor. And here today we have chairing this defense, it's Gretchen Daly, and members of the advisory committee. We have Alex Konings, Howard Zebker, and Scott Fendor. So I'm just going to take a moment and introduce Aakash. Bit of background, he did his BS in geosciences with honors at Franklin and Marshall College. Then he went to Boston College, where he did his master's degree in Earth Environmental Sciences. And he finished there in 2015 and went to the World Wildlife Fund for 9 months, working as a GIS expert. And then he went to NASA, the Goddard Space Flight Center, from 2015 to September 2017. And that's when his passion for remote sensing really seemed to take off. He was a researcher with their Hydrologic Sciences Lab. And he built near real time. This is a recurring theme in Akash's work. It always has to be near real time, even finishing a piece. No. Near real time satellite information systems to detect and assess the severity of floods, landslides, and droughts. And then I'm delighted to say he decided, hey, time to think about a PhD. And so I think you talked to Ryan Smith in my group. It wasn't me that made him decide to come here. It was really Ryan who was working with me at the time. Aakash talked to Ryan. And Akash's application to Stanford said what he wanted to do was use remote sensing, observation and models at various spatial and temporal scales to better understand the Earth system, particularly in the areas of water resources, etc. Well, it was absolutely amazing because I at that time had just become obsessed, if not too strong a word, with the idea of using remote sensing data to look at water science, water management. And we met at AGU in 2016. It clicked, and interestingly enough, anyone that comes to work with me realizes that I use your application material when I introduce you at your PhD defense, but it's too late because you've already applied and been admitted. So looking through Akash's application form, the group he worked with at NASA, someone commented that he'd just been told by a colleague that you would be running that organization one day. Don't know if I've ever told you that. But I had just then had an opportunity with the Moore Foundation to really move forward in this area of remote sensing for hydrologic sciences. And it was just very obvious that Aakash was going to be the perfect PhD student. And as part of his application, he expressed something that's a personal commitment, and it's to always leave something better than I found. And I think that's a great metric for success, not just in a PhD, but in life. And you'll hear today about what Aakash has done during his PhD. And given that I just told you, I was starting to think about using remote sensing for hydrology when Aakash arrived. I can definitely say he has left my research group and me better than he found it. So over to Aakash.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Rosemary. And thank you all so much for coming. Absolutely delighted to present my thesis research to you today. Titled my dissertation is Advancing the Use of Remote Sensing Data and Models to Understand Hydrologic Processes in California. So let's start at the beginning with water. The fundamental quantity that underpins all life, most life on Earth. Now humor me for a second here. Think of 2 or 3 images that come to mind when you see the word water on the screen. And I'm going to give you 5 seconds to think. All right, think of your images. Now, I'm not much of a betting man, but if I were, I would bet that you thought of liquid water, right? Pretty easy to forget that we can also have solid water and ice and snow and water vapor as gas when you only have 10 seconds to think. Like I said, I'm not a betting man, but I would actually double down and bet even more that you didn't think of groundwater, right? After all, it's underground. It's invisible to our bare eyes. But maybe we should all be thinking more about groundwater. Groundwater is 97% of Earth's liquid fresh water. So this absolutely massive resource. And it really underpins all aspects of our modern society. Groundwater supports the drinking water needs of more than 2 billion people. That's billion with a B, between a third and a quarter of all the population on Earth. Provides about a third of all global irrigation water, and agriculture consumes about 70% of water use globally. It's incredibly important for providing habitat for biodiversity and ecosystems. And part of that is sustaining surface water bodies. So you can actually think of rivers and lakes and streams as topographic expressions of the groundwater table. And let's not forget all of the incredible benefits that our surface water bodies provide. They generate hydroelectric power, they fuel industry, they provide transportation and recreation, so incredibly important. And groundwater can also be essential for climate adaptation, right? It can kind of act as a savings account or an emergency fund in times of drought when you might not have abundant surface water resources to draw upon. But that's if it's managed properly. And that's a pretty big if, as you will see. So managing groundwater, right, is important for all of these factors that are just essential to modern life. And common sense tells us we can't manage what we don't measure, right? Would you agree with me on that? Seeing some nods. Unfortunately, groundwater is fairly challenging to measure, okay? The primary way that this is done is through observations of the water table made in wells. And these are incredibly important. However, they have some serious limitations. Firstly, they only represent a single point in both space and time. So to get a sense of what a complex aquifer is doing, you might need to drill many wells and connect the dots, essentially. These are manual measurements. So people are traveling great distances, sometimes sticking a tape measure down a well, driving to the next one, recording the measurements manually. And these factors make the acquisition of well data quite costly in terms of both time and money. Moreover, lots of areas don't even have observation wells, or the data from the wells isn't publicly available. So how are we going to meet some of these measurement challenges for groundwater? As it turns out, groundwater can be measured from space. Sounds cool, right? How do we do this? Well, we do a technique called remote sensing. Remote sensing is simply the science of obtaining information about objects or areas from a distance. And when we talk about remote sensing from space, we're talking about satellite remote sensing, right? Very exciting time to be active in the satellite remote sensing community. There are hundreds of satellites recording all kinds of measurements, and we actually haven't even unlocked the full power of what we can do with this data yet. So, remote sensing of groundwater can not only improve the state of the science, but it can also help with key decisions and management, okay? In contrast with the measurements made in wells, remote sensing data has the advantages of broad coverage in both space and time, right? These satellites are acquiring data all over the entire world. It's automatic, right? So once you've written the software routine to process the data, you don't have to do that again. And moreover, it's free. So there's tons of space agencies around the world providing open source data from lots and lots of satellites. But you still need somebody to process and make sense of the data. And this is where my story begins. So remote sensing of groundwater can be fairly complicated, right? For the most part, we have indirect measurements of the properties we want. There are many different methods and instruments available. You have active sensors that emit a signal and listen for the echo. You have passive instruments that measure the reflected or emitted radiation. You have electromagnetic methods that record measurements of the electromagnetic spectrum. You have geodetic measurements, which either measure gravity or position very precisely. And this map on the right is showing a gravity-based estimate of the changes in groundwater storage over California that we'll get into. And all of these different instruments have different spatial resolutions, right? They have different footprints or pixel sizes on the land surface. They have different temporal resolutions, so they can image the same place on Earth every day, every week, or every 2 weeks. And they have different spectral resolutions, so they measure different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. And as a result, combining these data is quite challenging. And the full spectrum of remote sensing applications remains unknown, right? So we're just beginning to figure out what we can do with these data and how we can use them to study groundwater systems. And so the question that I've kept asking myself over the last 5 years, almost every day, if it's remotely sensed, is it remotely sensible? So challenge accepted. This is the PhD topic that I chose to take on. So let me dive into some of the research questions that I'm asking. Firstly, over what spatial scales can we use remote sensing data to recover the changes in groundwater storage through a mass balance approach? And secondly, to what extent can we combine remotely sensed and ground-based data to map the areas where groundwater begins as rain and snow on the surface? So where are we going to do this? We're going to do it in our study area, natural laboratory, backyard of California. This is a fabulous place to do this work. There are lots of available data, well measurements, groundwater models, reservoir levels, stream gauges, weather stations. The water system in California is extremely important. 30 million people depend on it in LA, San Francisco, Sacramento, and San Jose. Groundwater and water in general provides irrigation for more than 6 million acres of farmland, some of the most productive farmland in the country and the world. And we have a drought and overdraft problem in California. And you probably know that if you've been paying attention to the news. And excitingly, we had some recent legislation passed that actually mandates that groundwater changes must be monitored within California. So while we developed all of our models and methods for California, I want to stress that they are transferable to other areas of the world because of the utility of remote sensing data, because we have this data everywhere. So let's get into some of those research topics. First, I'm going to present the use of remote sensing data to monitor changes in groundwater storage. When I say changes in groundwater storage, I just mean the change in the mass of groundwater for a given area over time. Now, we do this over various spatial scales of investigation. Firstly, we look at the large scale, so hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. This is an area the size of states, and all the way down to the small scale, so thousands of square kilometers, areas the size of cities. For reference, Los Angeles is about 1,000 square kilometers. And there are different implications for management and decision-making at each of these scales. So at the large scale, you want to understand what's broadly going on to guide policy decisions at the state and federal levels. And at the small scale, you need to know what's going on in terms of the groundwater system to guide local allocation decisions. For instance, if you're a water district and want to figure out how much water is available for irrigation versus ecosystems versus water supply this growing season. Secondly, we'll talk about groundwater source areas. So where does groundwater start as rain and snow? And how does it percolate through the soil mantle to reach our streams? And the common thread between these two topics is the use of satellite remote sensing data to answer some of these questions. So with that, let's get into the first topic of groundwater storage changes. So we know that we can't manage what we don't measure, right? So let's go through some of the available methods that we can use to monitor changes in groundwater storage. Well, we already talked about groundwater monitoring wells. They're the only direct form of water level measurement, but they have these limitations, right? Sparse coverage in space and time. They're difficult to extrapolate and expensive to drill and sample. We also have numerical models, which simulate the physical processes of mass and energy transfer and can be used to estimate changes in the groundwater table. Now, these are extremely cool. They have high spatial resolution, and they're super useful for management or scenario analysis and planning. However, you need a lot of ground-based data, water levels, lithology types, surface water deliveries to set the boundary conditions in order to parameterize and calibrate these models. They're computationally expensive, and as a result, they lag years behind the present. For instance, in California, the flagship groundwater model put out by the Department of Water Resources is only available until 2016. So how are we going to adaptively manage our water resources during the current and ongoing drought if we don't have data past 2016? It's a challenge. Lastly, we have gravimetric measurements from satellites, aircraft, and ground-based gravimeters. These are direct observations of changes in mass. They're excellent for regional scale estimates, and you have free data from the Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment produced by NASA, measuring changes in Earth's gravity field every 2 weeks. However, the airborne and ground-based platforms are expensive, which prohibits kind of the time dimension monitoring, and the satellite platforms are pretty low resolution, so you can't really answer any of those local management decisions using the gravity-based satellite data. So I am proposing a new method, a different method, an alternative method to understand changes in groundwater storage, and that's called the water balance method. It's actually beautiful and elegant in its simplicity. You simply estimate the changes in groundwater over an area by adding up the fluxes in, subtracting away the fluxes out, and accounting for other changes occurring within that area. So the way to think of this is like your checking account, okay? You have a balance. That's the amount of water in the area. You have deposits. That increases your balance. You have withdrawals. That decreases your balance. And actually, the commonalities between personal finance and groundwater do not end there. You can overdraft your groundwater resources, and the fun goes on. So let's talk about some of those fluxes in and fluxes out. When I say flux, I mean something that moves. So water that is moving into or out of our system. And our primary flux in is obviously precipitation, right? Rain and snow happening in our study area. But you can also have stream flow, water traveling in rivers and streams running into the area, and runoff, water traveling over the land surface into our area. In terms of fluxes out, the big one is evapotranspiration, right? That is the transport of water from the liquid phase to the gaseous phase, either from evaporation on the surface or transpiration through plants from the shallow subsurface. And we also have to account for our sinks or our states within our area, right? So those are groundwater, soil moisture, surface water, and snow. And in sum, they make up the total water storage. So let's put some variable names on each of these processes. And if you just think about the logic that I laid out in the last 2 or 3 minutes, you can write down some simple equations that let us solve for the change in groundwater storage. So we know that the change in storage is just our flux in minus our flux out. We can plug in some of our fluxes in and fluxes out. And I note here that Q net and R net are simply the difference between stream flow in and stream flow out, and runoff in and runoff out. And then we also know that the change in storage is kind of the sum of its parts, right? So the change in groundwater, soil moisture, snow, and surface water will equal the total change in water storage. And if you just combine those two equations and do a little bit of rearranging, you'll see that we can write down this equation that estimates the change in groundwater by adding up the fluxes in, subtracting out the fluxes out, and accounting for the other changes within our area. So this is cool, right? Like we have a simple equation that we can use now to estimate changes in groundwater over an area. But how are we going to figure out what data that we can plug into this? Well, let's move away from my bad PowerPoint art and put a better hydrologic cycle diagram. And I've just put some of those fluxes and states on there where they belong. And we actually incredibly have on the ground measurements that can be used to measure almost all of these things. So rain gauges to measure rain, snow pillows to measure snow, flux towers to measure evaporation and transpiration, reservoir gauges and stream gauges to measure water level heights, and piezometers to measure soil moisture. However, these instruments all have the same problems as wells, right? They're a single point in space and time, difficult and expensive to maintain and sample, often located in remote locations, and so on. We also have what are called land surface models that we can use to estimate some of these fluxes and states. Now, these are similar to groundwater models in that they solve the equations of energy and mass transfer, given inputs of meteorologic data, so precipitation and temperature primarily. They simulate all these mass and energy transfer fluxes, and they produce estimates of changes in groundwater, changes in soil moisture, evapotranspiration, and so on. These models are great, they're super useful. However, they really struggle in areas with significant human modification. So they struggle to capture things like irrigation, things like reservoirs, canals, aqueducts. Anytime we as humans are transporting water sort of against the natural system, these models struggle to capture it. Now, if you've been listening, you know that I am very excited about the prospect of satellite data to measure, monitor all of these fluxes and states. Incredibly, we now have all of these data sets that are measuring these variables all the time, in all the places. NASA's collecting more than 4 terabytes of satellite data per day, and that's growing fast. That's going to be more than 80 terabytes after the launch of a few new satellites. So very exciting time to be a remote sensing scientist. So bearing all of this in mind, I set out to answer the question, can we use this hydrologic remote sensing data to accurately estimate changes in groundwater storage? And if so, at what spatial scales? Now, this approach would have some serious advantages relative to the status quo. Firstly, we can have these low latency, up-to-date estimates of changes in groundwater, which has been a challenge thus far. We don't need much ground-based data at all to do this, so we can extrapolate it to other areas of the world. And we have an increasing number of data sources available to estimate all of the required variables. So let's walk through how I did this, okay? So I have data describing each of these variables in our water balance equation: satellite data, ground-based data, and land surface model data. I use a technique called triple collocation to estimate the uncertainty present in each estimate of each variable. Then I create water balance scenarios using combinations of the data sets to understand how well they perform recovering the changes in groundwater storage. So I use all the data to create hundreds of models. I use ground-based data and land surface model data. I use all remote sensing data. And then I select the best remote sensing data by minimizing the uncertainty from the previous step. So that is what I'm showing here. For those in the room, it's a little difficult to see my ensemble members in this plot, but you can think of lots of gray squiggly lines above and below the blue line. Those are our ensemble members. Those are our hundreds of models. And our blue line is the best estimate of changes in groundwater storage that we've derived by minimizing the uncertainty for each of these variables. And of course, I have to figure out if this model is doing a good job. Is it working, right? So I have to validate it against independent data sources that I'll talk about now. So at each spatial scale of investigation, we use a different validation data source. At the largest spatial scale, we use those gravity satellites, which are measuring changes in the gravity field. At the medium and small scales, we use results from a groundwater flow model and groundwater wells. Now, here is a map showing the spatial scales of investigation that I just introduced. The biggest spatial scale is shown in this red polygon. It's the Central Valley watershed. This is an area that encompasses all of the Sierra Nevada mountains, so very high peaks. Those mountains supply most of the water that is used in California. The second area of investigation, shown as a green polygon, is the Central Valley. It is extremely important for food security, produces about 2/3 of the fruits and nuts grown here in the US. It's a very flat area, so quite a contrast from the Central Valley watershed, which is very mountainous. And then we also selected these two sub-basins within the Central Valley, shown as black polygons, which are thousands of square kilometers to test our approach. So here is, we're going to start with the coarsest, the biggest spatial scale. Here is an animation showing our validation data set, the gravity recovery and climate experiment satellites. It is measuring the change in groundwater storage over California during a recent drought occurring from 2007 to 2009. Red means bad, red means loss of groundwater. So that's what you're seeing here as we get into some of the years of the drought. And if we just look at the time series, we can see some interesting things. So this plot is showing the change in the groundwater storage on the y-axis in millimeters on the left and cubic kilometers on the right. The validation data, the GRACE satellites, the gravity instrument that I just showed, is shown in green. And my model, the remote sensing water balance, is shown in blue. A couple of things to point out here. Firstly, both models, my model and the validation data, capture this kind of seasonal cycle in California, right? In California, we have these wet winters where the groundwater table gets recharged and dry summers where we lose water. So those are those oscillations capturing the seasonal cycle. We also see some negative trends during droughts from both data sources, which obviously makes a lot of sense. But the model that I developed, shown in blue, struggles to kind of capture the positive change between the drought periods that you kind of see between 2010 and 11 and 2017. We think this is due to some of the limitations of the remotely sensed precipitation data as it's not able to capture the true peaks of the extreme events occurring in the mountains. And I should have mentioned, this is an area about the size of Illinois, so quite large. Now we're going to zoom in by about a factor of 3 to the Central Valley. This is about the size of Vermont and New Hampshire for reference. And I'm also showing the axes on this plot are the same. I'm showing the remote sensing water balance in blue, but now I'm validating against a groundwater model and well data, which I am showing in green and orange respectively. And I'll just go ahead and say it. I think the agreement is really good here in terms of comparing my model with the validation data sets. Seasonality, check. Trends during droughts, check. The correlation value between the model that I developed and the validation data source is about 0.9, and the trends during droughts fall within about 15% of one another. So fairly confident that we're doing a good job capturing the conditions here. However, this plot really highlights one of the limitations of the validation data sets that I use, and that is those up-to-date estimates of changes in groundwater storage. So if you direct your attention to the green line showing the groundwater model, you'll see that there aren't data available past 2016. And if you look at the well data, you'll see that there aren't data available past 2019. Now, when we did the study in 2021, we were able to produce estimates until the end of 2020. And indeed, you can produce estimates of changes in groundwater up till a few months ago from today, should you want to. Zooming in even further to one of the subbasins, this is about three times the size of Los Angeles. Again, similar results. The model I developed is doing a pretty good job capturing the trends, capturing the seasonality. It compares favorably with the validation data sets. And again, you'll see that this time it's providing data until the end of 2021, since we did this study this year. Again, highlighting the advantages of our up-to-date estimates. Zooming in further, this is now an area about twice the size of Los Angeles. You'll see some different results where I'm not doing a great job of capturing the trends as suggested by the validation data. Now, this discrepancy could be due to a number of factors. Firstly, we weren't able to reconcile the inflows and the outflows, set the boundary conditions that we needed with the accuracy required in order to close the water balance, essentially. And so we were forced to use changes in reservoir storage for a very large reservoir just proximal to the study area as a proxy for this inflow and the outflow. And that's causing these very large magnitude fluctuations in contrast with the minimal magnitude fluctuations suggested by the groundwater model and the well data. The other thing that could be going on here is we're simply breaching the applicability limits of our remote sensing based data in terms of our spatial scales. Maybe we can't apply this past this spatial scale. Our group is actively working on this to figure this out. So to wrap up this section, we, for the first time, demonstrated that a remotely sensed water balance can recover the changes in groundwater storage across 3 spatial scales. We compared with validation data at each scale. We did a good job. I should say I for all of this. So just if I say we, think I'm saying I. Did a good job recovering the trends during droughts and the seasonality. I need to do more work to understand the uncertainty and the limitations due to the spatial scale and boundary conditions. And importantly, we have these low latency estimates. I have these low latency estimates. There are a number of important limitations associated with this method that one should bear in mind. We currently need ground-based streamflow data to do this. That will be alleviated by the forthcoming surface water ocean topography satellite, which will be launched in just a few weeks. Very exciting times. This model produces area integrated estimates, so we're not gridding anything. We are limited in practice by the footprint of the remote sensing estimates. The model assumes negligible groundwater inflow and outflow, which is a pretty reasonable assumption at the larger scales, but it gets less and less reasonable as you zoom in further and further. And finally, this hasn't been tested in other areas. As far as the contributions to the state of the science, this is the first time that the remotely sensed water balance has been demonstrated at spatial scale spanning 3 orders of magnitude. The uncertainty is quantified not only in the final changes in groundwater storage that are estimated, but in terms of the water balance components, which is also important. And finally, we produce these low latency estimates, also at a low cost. So I hope that I've convinced you that it is possible to use remote sensing data to estimate the changes in groundwater storage through a mass balance approach across spatial scales. And now let us move on to the second project I'll talk about concerning groundwater source areas. So some terminology to get out of the way first. We need to define base flow, okay? Base flow is the groundwater fed component of stream flow. So the way to think about this, have you ever been out to a river and it hasn't rained recently, but there's still water flowing in the river? Seeing some nods, yeah. If you live around here, you probably have. That is base flow, okay? That is the component of stream flow fed by the drainage of groundwater aquifers into these stream channels. Another way to conceptualize this is like this. Let's stick a stream gauge, which measures the flow over time in the center of our river. And if we're looking at the flow over time after a rainstorm or a snowmelt event, you'll see the flow increase and then gradually taper off, right? But this is actually two distinct processes. This is the surface runoff, which is the process by which rain or snow flows directly over the land surface into a river. And that is in contrast with base flow, which results when rain or snow slowly drains, percolates through the soils, reaches the groundwater table, and then flows laterally into streams. So these are two different processes, and that is important to note. Now, base flow is about half of annual stream flow in California. So it's very, very important, especially during the summer when we have almost no rain and almost no surface runoff. And I'm going to use base flow, I'm going to use reservoir operation as a motivating example, but there are many other reasons why understanding base flow is important. But reservoirs in California and around the world are these massively important resources. They currently account for about half of the global variation in surface water storage. They obviously store water, they generate hydropower, they supply water for recharge, for groundwater recharge, which is a practice gaining a lot of momentum in California, where when you have excess water, you can apply it to the land surface, it drains down and reaches the groundwater table and recharges it. Then you have your water back in your savings account that you can use during a time of drought. And finally, flood control, right? Reservoirs serve all of these functions, and some of them have kind of competing objectives, right? So you obviously want a higher water level for storing water, for hydropower, but you want a lower water level for flood control. So how do we sort of balance these competing objectives? Because most reservoirs serve multiple functions. Here's kind of a pictographic illustration of some of those challenges. In terms of water supply and hydropower, this is showing the same, the maps on the left are showing the same reservoir less than a year and a half apart during an extreme drought and an extremely wet period. And that wet period actually overwhelmed the spillway and resulted in over $1 billion of damage. So understanding how base flow contributes to the systems is extremely important. Moreover, climate change, as we know, will cause a shift from snow to rain. And that shift may be quite dramatic in the next 20, 50, 100 years. Climate change alters the timing, duration, and magnitude of these hydrologic processes. And so understanding how we can update our operational practices in light of the changes due to climate change will be extremely important. We, as some people have said, we are using a 20th century playbook for a 21st century problem. So with that, the goal of my study, we identified this pressing need to identify baseflow drivers and how they are likely to shift. And in terms of the previous work on this topic, there are a few kind of shortcomings that I'll highlight. Firstly, most studies did not distinguish between rainfall and snowmelt. They just used precipitation, which is the sum of rain and snow. A lot of studies, most studies do not distinguish between base flow and surface runoff, right? Those two processes which sum to stream flow. They use an arbitrary time parameter, which means that you might do this analysis over a year or over a season, depending on what you're interested in. And there's a limited use of some exciting methods that I'll present today in hydrologic science. So to that end, let's talk about the research question. Which areas have the strongest influence on base flow through the processes of rainfall and snowmelt? And can we use both ground-based and remotely sensed data to advance our understanding of how these processes impact baseflow. Oops. We are going to our favorite old stomping grounds of the Sierra Nevada of California to do this work. I selected 15 watersheds sized 1,000 to 25,000 square kilometers. They are shown in the white outlines in the map on the right-hand side. Watershed just means all of the areas that drain to a single point, okay? And in the Sierras, those points are basically occupied by reservoirs. Those reservoirs are shown as orange circles, and they're extremely important for supplying the agricultural water, municipal water used in California, and also generating hydropower. They generate about 10 or 15% of annual electricity consumed. So how did I go about doing this? Started with remotely sensed inputs of rainfall and snowmelt and ground-based estimates of stream flow. We know that we're interested in base flow, so we carried out what is called base flow separation to separate the surface runoff from the base flow. We simply apply a low pass filter that gets rid of all of the high magnitude or spiky parts of the signal and lets through all of the lower magnitude parts of the signal that correspond to base flow. So we're getting rid of the surface runoff and only keeping the base flow. Next, we compute what are called aquifer drainage timescales. And this is the amount of time that it takes for the aquifer to fully drain back into the stream channel and reach its equilibrium state. Now, the way that we do this is through application of a technique called base flow recession analysis. And in base flow recession analysis, we eliminate all of these surface runoff periods, select only the times when that aquifer drainage is occurring, and then plot the stream flow, which I'm showing in the plot on the right, against its time derivative. We fit a power law to that equation, and the slope of the power law is actually proportional to the amount of time that it takes for these aquifers to drain. So I estimated a drainage timescale of about 27 days for all of the watersheds in the Sierra Nevada. The scatter plot is showing different watersheds as different colors. And this actually agrees relatively well with published values that have applied this method to estimate drainage timescales in other areas of the world. Okay, so we have our base flow, we have our aquifer drainage timescales. Now we can apply some computational methods to identify the areas where base flow begins. We're going to talk about two methods, cross-correlation and transfer entropy. Cross-correlation, widely used in signal processing. I'm not sure why this animation is frozen, but don't worry about it. Uh-oh. Oh dear. that was inopportune. I did not prepare the alternate no slides version, but luckily we have a whiteboard here. Okay, I think this is starting up again. This didn't happen in any of my practices.
It never does.
Let's go. Where were we?
There's something about video and Zoom though.
It tests you, right? This is all part of the process. Okay, we are just about back. I hope that this will go back into the correct Zoom mode. I'm going to just let the Zoom people holler if it's wrong. I'm going to assume that it's fine. So, okay, great. We have our base flow. We have our aquifer drainage timescales. Now I'm going to motivate the computational techniques that we apply. So cross-correlation and transfer entropy. Not going to freeze this time. Good stuff. In cross-correlation, we measure the similarity between two time series at a certain time displacement, right? So you can think of, and in this equation, I should say, F of t is our daily base flow, G of t is either daily rainfall or snowmelt, and tau is time lag. And in the plots on the right and the animations on the right, you can think of the blue as being our base flow and the red signal as being either our rainfall or snowmelt. We slide one signal across the other, and then we're computing the cross correlation as a function of the time displacement. Introducing our other method of transfer entropy. This measures how much information can be obtained about one variable by observing the past history of that variable and also the past history of another variable. So in our case, we are asking the question, how much uncertainty can we reduce about knowing base flow today by observing the past base flow and also the past rainfall and snowmelt? So that is what is being shown in this Venn diagram here. We are essentially quantifying the information reduction about base flow due to the knowledge of the previous base flow and rainfall or snowmelt. And that's kind of indicated by this hatched red area in our Venn diagram. So if I put up these two techniques and the equations for them, you will see that they both have this time lag variable, this time lag parameter that has been set semi-arbitrarily in the past. I have computed aquifer drainage timescales, which I can inject into these equations and estimate the time parameter with empirical data. So, okay, we now have our whole workflow, and let me get into some of the outputs that we produce. So these maps are showing the correlation between snowmelt and base flow in the middle. Oh, I have a little Zoom chat. Oh, that's distracting. Okay. The middle map is showing the correlation between snowmelt and base flow. The right-hand map is showing the correlation between rainfall and base flow. The first thing you notice is that snowmelt and base flow are much more tightly correlated than rainfall and base flow, right? And this actually makes sense if you think about it. So snowmelt kind of can occur quite slowly. The water can melt over time. It can percolate and trickle down through the soil, reach the groundwater table, and flow laterally. Whereas rainfall kind of arrives more suddenly, all at once, right? And so it might contribute more to that surface runoff component of the signal. And so what implications does this have for our climate shifts from snow to rain? It begs the question, right? How will this affect base flow if we know that our snowmelt is much more correlated with base flow relative to the rainfall, which we're likely to see more of in the future? Another observation here, the snowmelt base flow correlation is higher in the south than in the north. The south corresponds to sort of the highest peaks that get the most snow in this area. And we have the opposite dynamic in terms of rainfall, where we have a higher correlation in the north relative to the south. Another thing you'll notice here are these kind of discontinuous boundaries across watershed lines, right? A stark contrast from one watershed to the other. This can be due to a number of factors, things like slope, vegetation, hydraulic conductivity, soils, lithology, so many factors. But it has an important implication, right? And I should have mentioned, this is also borne out in the transfer entropy results, where you also see these stark contrasts. These maps are showing information content of snowmelt to base flow in the center and rainfall to base flow on the right. And these kind of stark contrasts across watershed lines have an important implication, right? You might actually need a different management plan to understand the base flow dynamics, even in adjacent watersheds. So these watersheds can be quite different despite proximity. Here's another way of looking at the results. These plots are showing the elevation on the y-axis in meters, and the plot on the left-hand side shows the mean annual snowmelt as a function of the elevation in gray, and the mean annual precipitation in blue. The center left plot shows the correlation as a function of elevation for both rainfall and snowmelt. So you'll notice again that the correlation for snowmelt is much higher than rainfall. And then the center right plot shows the information content of both rainfall and snowmelt as a function of elevation. And the final plot on the right just shows the number of pixels in each elevation bin. Now, a few things to point out here. Firstly, the areas which experience the highest annual rates of snowmelt do not necessarily have the greatest impacts on base flow, right? So we have the highest snowmelt occurring in this about 1500 to 1200 meter range, but we have the highest correlation and the highest information content around 3000 to 3500 meters. So that's interesting, right? And again, what are the implications for climate change? What shifts will we observe due to these phenomena? And interestingly, a study that used a totally independent method also identified this approximately 3,250 meter elevation zone as an important source for base flow. They used a geochemical method and looked at headwater streams in Colorado. So to wrap it up, I, for the first time, integrated ground-based and remotely sensed data to identify the source areas contributing to base flow. I went beyond past studies by separating both rainfall and snowmelt, separating surface runoff and base flow from stream flow, and quantifying the aquifer drainage timescales using empirical data, which other studies have not done. In terms of future work, I think this could be used to study the effects of land use changes on base flow, right? How does it respond to fire, logging, and other phenomena? And what role do other environmental variables play, right? Slope, soil moisture, and ET. We need to integrate them into the analysis to better understand the system dynamics. Circling back to the first project on remote sensing of groundwater storage changes, I demonstrated the first application of a remotely sensed water balance to estimate changes in groundwater at 3 orders of spatial magnitude. I validated this against independent estimates at each spatial scale, found relatively good results at 3 out of the 4 areas. I quantified the uncertainty among all of the water balance components and among our estimates of changes in groundwater storage. And importantly, the method I developed is able to provide these low latency estimates of changes in groundwater that are just a few months out of date, whereas other methods lag years behind the present. We are very, very excited about the surface water ocean topography satellite. So excited that I think Anna and I will go to the launch at Vandenberg Air Force Base in a few weeks. Also very excited to extrapolate this method to other areas encompassing different climates, hydrogeologic settings, and water management scenarios. And in terms of the general outlook for remote sensing and hydrology and water resources, well, it's bright. If you are a remote sensing nerd like me, you might say that it has a high spectral reflectance. So one technique of remote sensing that we didn't even talk about today is actually the use of global positioning systems and interferometric synthetic aperture radar data to recover properties of confined aquifers. We think there's potential, I think there's potential to integrate some of these methods. And of course, I won't shut up about the surface water ocean topography satellite that can provide remotely sensed estimates of stream flow and allow us to do a fully remote sensing based water balance. So with that, I will leave you with this word cloud of my thesis. The size of the text corresponds to the frequency in the document where the words appear. And I want to say for all the technical people out there, if you want to go and look at the code, everything is open source and available online. Thank you so much for coming, and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay. Wow, fantastic job. I know relatively little about any of this, except living here in California and experiencing all the changes you're talking about. I bet there are a lot of people in the room with similar experience in California and elsewhere, and just thinking about different dimensions of the work. Let's have some questions or reflections.
I think also there is an ability to ask questions on Zoom. So if you're on Zoom, feel free to type them in. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk, Ash. I have a question about your first part, about the quantifying of the groundwater storage. In your results, you always had your new estimate and then compared it to some existing estimate, the groundwater model, wells, etc. I guess something that might be desirable with this approach would be to take it somewhere where we have a very data poor area, so you don't have the existing estimate, and remote sensing should be available anywhere. The real strength of this. Do you think we're close to being able to do that, or where do you see the kind of biggest limitations in the remote sensing approach?
Yeah, that's a good question. And for the people on Zoom, Matt basically asked about extrapolating this to areas without any ground truth data. How confident can we be in those estimates? I would say it sort of remains unknown. I would kind of caution the application and the overconfidence of a remote sensing based approach in an area where you don't have any other available validation data. Certainly what we've seen is that some of the remote sensing data, particularly around evapotranspiration, can be extremely uncertain. So those uncertainties can really propagate through the mass balance. And if you don't have good estimates for even one variable, they can totally throw off your mass balance estimates. So I would say possible, something that the community hopefully can flesh out in the coming years.
So when you're doing your remote sensing and you're comparing it to ground data in space, what satellites are you using for the remote sensing part?
Yeah, I have a full list in the paper that was published last year, but I'll name a few if you like. There's like for precipitation, we use GPM and TRIM. For ET, we use MODIS-based data and different models applied to that. The best one is called CBOP. Soil moisture, we use SMAP, SMOS. What else? We use kind of MODIS-based energy balance modeling for the snow components, but happy to direct you to the table in the paper that has all the gory details and the references.
Go for it.
So for your baseball stuff, I think it's kind of really exciting to be able to look at future climate scenarios and see how that might impact baseball in the future. Does your approach have the ability to pick out individual years that might be more representative of future climate? So years where we have less snow but more precipitation, and compare that to, say, the average?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll just repeat it. Meredith asked about considering sub-annual or smaller time periods for the base flow analysis in the context of future climate change. And I'll mention that I did actually a bunch of experiments looking at shorter periods of time, applying this technique at the seasonal scale, at the annual scale, following extreme events. So we can definitely talk about that. I think it's possible. I think you would have to be really careful about drawing conclusions about each of those individual events or time periods. Obviously, when you have more and more data, you can be more and more confident in the results you're getting. So kind of zooming into those smaller time periods, I think could be interesting, but also challenging.
Go for
Yeah.
it.
Really great. I learned so much. Just one question. You mentioned that you could use this model to understand how land use change might affect like the water balance. And I was wondering if that was like something you were thinking about in the context of working trees, like incentives for like land use change. And like I know Gretchen's done a lot of work on water funds, and this is like one of the areas people are willing to pay for water. So I was wondering, have you thought about that in the context of working trees? And do you think that data like this can be used to measure the variables needed to pay people for better watershed management?
Yeah, to be totally honest, I haven't really thought about that in that context. What I will say is most of these satellite instruments have footprints that are too coarse to really recover the hyperlocal land use changes. So I think it could be possible with a higher resolution data, something like Planet Labs or similar, but not something that I've explicitly addressed.
Okay, cool.
Really great questions so far. Any more?
We actually have a question online from Robert Walter, if I can share, Akash. He says, yeah, in the second part, you mentioned that snow melt is poorly correlated with base flow. And I'm curious if this is due to the latency between when snow melts and whether or how quickly it infiltrates.
Yeah, Bob, I don't know if you were paying close enough attention because I mentioned that snowmelt is tightly correlated with base flow. Rainfall is not very correlated with base flow. And I think, this is due to the distinctions in those two processes that I mentioned, right? Snowmelt, slowly melting, percolating down through the soil, being more influential in terms of that base flow process, whereas precipitation, especially in California, can be very extreme. It can arrive all at once. There's some statistic that I'm going to butcher if I commit to it, but it's like half of the precipitation volumetric, half of the volumetric precipitation occurs in like 4 or 5 separate rainstorms. So quite rapid all at once. And you would expect that to be more tightly coupled with surface runoff rather than base flow. So I can tease Bob a little bit because he's my old advisor.
Great one. I think he's just making sure you're, still awake.
Keep me on my toes.
Yeah. Any other tests of Akash's work here?
We do have a guest Ram Chan, who raised their hand, so I'm going to allow them to talk right now to ask a question.
All right.
Go ahead.
They're muted.
Are they there, Ram Chan? Okay,
If
maybe
that
they're
is
not.
my uncle Ramu in Bangalore, I'll take this opportunity to say hi to him.
Okay, well, there's another question in Q&A. It says, for the water balance model where you can quantify uncertainty associated with each of the components, is there one component that stands out as contributing to the most to the uncertainty?
Yes, at every area that we investigated, evapotranspiration was the most uncertain component. And that we are excited about the potential for new evapotranspiration models, particularly the open evapotranspiration platform, to provide a better estimate of ET using state-of-the-art models and reduce that kind of uncertainty. But yeah, far and away, evapotranspiration is challenging to measure, model and monitor, very spatially heterogeneous. So that would definitely be the most uncertain component. I should mention, though, that previous studies that have done water balance analyses throughout the world have mostly found precipitation to be the most uncertain component, but it could very well be geographically specific.
Cool. Anybody else in the room or online? Any final reflections? Yeah, great.
So it seems like you have a lot of really good data for cross spatial and temporal scales, but with some distinct kind of gaps in between them, like remote sensing data, maybe it's hard to get down to the fine scales, and then the fine scale is not spatially and temporally extensive. Have you thought about, because you have so much data, trying to use some machine learning methods to sort of fill in at some of those scales over time?
I think these are things that we explored in our machine learning class a few years ago. I mean, one area that jumps to mind is like the use of techniques like image in painting to fill in clouds, things like that. Not something that I've addressed for my PhD work at all, but I do think there are, downscaling and hyper resolution machine learning techniques that are promising in terms of doing that kind of downscaling.
Great. Okay, well, I think we should all thank.
I have an
Akash.
acknowledgement section that I
Okay,
would love
great.
to go through.
Now we're in trouble.
Well, firstly, thank you so much to Rosemary. Rosemary is a brilliant scientist, but an even better person. And she's taught me so much, not only about science, but how to treat people, how to have outsized impact, be a good mentor, prioritize your time, and how to be kind and gracious in one's interactions. So thank you so much for everything. My committee, Alex, thank you so much for everything. I had great fun doing my second project with you. And firstly, I should have said, it was just a true pleasure to learn from masters at their craft in so many ways. So Alex, your remote sensing of hydrology class was just like the coolest thing since sliced bread. And thank you for introducing me to triple collocation, which ended up being a great part of my work. So Howard, you wrote the book on radar signal processing. It was really fun to implement your Fortran algorithms in Python. Oops. Scott, I have learned so much about water quality from you and your group. It's kind of a blind spot in my research and in my background. And so I think the work that you're doing is incredibly important from the public health standpoint. And it's really helped round out my perspectives in the holistic terms, interfacing with you and your group. And finally, Gretchen, I mean, the stuff that you've done for valuing nature is just second to none. And I'm just so grateful for your help and support with my post-PhD plans. So just deeply grateful for all of you and your help. And I should also mention the countless interactions that I've had with all of your students, through which I feel like I've osmosis, like I've learned things from you through osmosis, perhaps. The environmental geophysics group, what an all-star cast of characters, truly. I'm gonna name everyone: Meredith, Mike, Becca, Surprise, Gordon, Noah, Wes, Marguerite, Matt, Carissa, Javi, Sagi, and lots of other people who have graduated. I love the way we all help and support each other. I hope we can all continue to be friends and collaborators for a very long time. I want to give a quick acknowledgement of one of our group members who we lost this year, Alex Kendrick. He is a kind and humble and unassumingly brilliant person, and just a joy to have spent time with, and his light lives on among all of us. Thank you so much to the amazing geophysics staff. I think I've outlasted like half of the people on this list. So, but yeah, just especially I'll call out Rachel and Liliani and Jeremy and Jared. Couldn't have done any of this without your help and support. This is a super long list of names. If you're going to take a screenshot on Zoom, do it now. If you want to find yourself, this is alphabetized by first name. I think this is like everyone I interacted with in the last 5 years. So yeah. I got to thank my collaborators. These are people who directly helped me with this research by providing data or, you know, helping me logic out some questions I had, or I mean, in some cases, even like helping with code and stuff like that. So Rich, Surprise, and Mike in particular, they're all here. Deeply appreciative. Forrest, Taya, Zihan, Noah, and Kihan, thank you so much for everything. I gotta thank my mentors from my past lives, Dorothy and Bob at F&M, seen here in their natural habitat. Thank you for introducing me to science and taking a chance on me and encouraging me to foster my curiosity. Noah Snyder at BC. I don't have specific anecdotes for everybody here, but I do appreciate you all. John Bolton and Dahlia Kirschbaum from NASA Goddard, and Venkat Lakshmi from University of Virginia. There's no way that I would have done a PhD without the help and support from all of you. And I just want to double click and underline, like, thank you for encouraging me to foster my curiosity and try to be the best scientist that I can. And I also want to congratulate Dorothy on her induction into the National Academy this year. My friends, thank you so much to everybody for the camping trips, the park hangs, the treehouse afternoons. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Too many people to name, but I appreciate you all. My family, where to start? Thanks for supporting and encouraging me. My uncles, my aunts, my godfathers, my cousins, some of whom are here, and my in-laws, also my grandparents and my dad who passed. My in-laws, happy birthday to my father-in-law tomorrow. Hope to celebrate soon. My mom, man, I love you, Mom. Thank you so much for encouraging me to follow my dreams. And thank you for providing me with a safe and wholesome environment, despite being a single mother and an immigrant and facing no shortage of challenges. I can't believe I'm going to say this, but in 2014, when Kevin Durant won the NBA MVP, he said, "Mom, you're the real MVP." And so today, I'm going to say, "Mom, you're the real PhD." And lastly, my fiance, Anna, thank you so much for everything. Thanks for pushing me even when I felt like quitting. Thanks for dealing with my weird schedule. Thanks for getting us out of the Bay Area bubble and into the wilderness. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, thanks for being patient with me as I endlessly speculated on mountain hydrology during our backpacking trip. I know that must have been pretty boring for you. With that, I'm done. Thank you all so much.
Beautiful job. These are just the best days. Now we're gonna take him away for a little bit just to make a show of it, Stanford. And then re-deliver him in the afternoon. The timing is exactly.
So just take a 5-minute break.
That's sure.
5-minute break, does that work?
Did we stay in this?
Yeah, we stayed.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.